Okay, guys, we're back. Now we have Niklas Rindtorff. He's a physician scientist and a founder of LabDAO, an online community of life scientists collaborating to increase the accessibility to life science tools. He's a researcher and a scholar training Heidelberg and received a master's degree in biomedical informatics from Harvard Medical School. Today, he will talk about LabDAO and openlab, a peer-to-peer exchange for life science laboratory services. Please join me in welcoming him on stage. Niklas.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Niklas, and I'm going to be talking about LabDAO, where we're building a research organization online. So the first question that you should ask yourself when you're trying to build a research organization is, what defines an effective research environment? And luckily, that's a question that we're not the first ones to ask. There have been a lot of people asking that question in the past. They've been looking at cases like Bell Labs or DARPA to really try to figure out what makes a research environment very effective. And actually, people have studied that, and then they proposed some new ways to build research organizations. And this is just a quick outtake of that, where, for example, Joan Benet is suggesting these internet-native, crypto-native powered ARPAs. And Benjamin Reinhardt is thinking about private ARPAs. Michael Nielsen is writing about reinventing discovery using online-powered research organizations. And Adam Marblestone and Sam Rodriguez have been writing about focused research organizations. So we're currently seeing a Cambrian explosion of new proposed ways to organize scientific activity. I think there's one case study that has been somewhat understudied and that can be very informative for how you could build a research organization that exists completely online. And those are the phage courses at Cold Spring Harbor right after World War II. So Cold Spring Harbor is this little town. It's about 50 minutes from New York City. And very few people know that this is where some of the fundamental research happened that basically led to the founding stones of molecular biology today as we know it. And what happened there? Well, over the summers, scientists from all over the US and Europe would come together, and they could spend the summer tinkering while they gave courses about the biology of phages. And what's very special about that, so phages are these little viruses that only target bacteria and not human cells. And what was special about it was that these scientists, they came from all different places and all different training backgrounds. So, for example, you had Max Delbrück, who was actually a physicist by training, but he was hanging out with all these biologists. And then not only were there very diverse teams, they were also at a place where there was some laboratory space to actually go and tinker, and so there was infrastructure available. And then last but not least, there was a bit of funding so they could come together, they could propose a new research idea, and then they could go back to their home institutions and write the big grant to get serious follow-on funding with that idea. And I think that idea is very powerful for what we're trying to do. The key lessons here are that an effective research environment needs to have access to scientific infrastructure. Like, you need a lab space to do the really interesting stuff. You need to be able to tinker at the edge of what's theory. You need to be able to form very dynamic teams where someone with micro expertise can come in. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody on that team has to have grad school experience. They can be very broadly skilled. And then the last one, at least, there needs to be at least some funding for prototypes and infrastructure to emerge. Now, you could ask yourself, why does all of this matter? Why do we need yet another research organization? And why especially do we need a research organization that's completely online? And this is a bit of a personal story. So what you can see on this graph here is the flow of inventors across countries, net, where on the y-axis, you can see an inflow of inventors into a given country in gray. And when it's a white bar, it means that actually this country is churning inventors. And an inventor in this study is defined as someone who has issued or filed a patent. So here you can see there are a couple of countries that are winners in this ecosystem, like the United States, Switzerland, Singapore, and they're attracting inventors. But then there is a large group of countries that are net exporters of inventors. So if you're creative, if you are well-trained, if you have a lot of new ideas, there are only very few places in the world where you can be home, where you have the place to tinker, the teams, the dynamic teams to form, and the funding available to like follow your ideas and test them against reality. Now, I personally was born here, moved over here, came back, moved there, came back, moved here, came back, and eventually asked the question, how many more times do I have to do this? And also, how many more people are in this pocket over here of this graph that do not have the chance to like, go to the right side of the graph and actually try to pursue their scientific ideas? So let's build a home for inventors online. Let's build an online community where people can come with their wild ideas, people can get some specific training that they require, and actually form research proposals and go that first step that you could do when you were at Cold Spring Harbor, which is come together in a team, do the very first experiment, see whether your idea has legs, and then go and apply for follow-on funding. And this is all part of a broader mission that this DeSci ecosystem is on that you might have heard of before, where DeSci stands for decentralized science, where we really want to give everybody the opportunity to raise funding for their scientific endeavor. We want to enable everyone to have access to laboratory services or any type of specialized scientific service. And then where we also want to develop new economic mechanisms that token engineering allows us, where data sharing and sharing of materials is both incentivized for the inventor and also is available and maintains accessibility for everybody else in the community. And maybe before I dive into what we're doing at LabDAO and how the OpenLab Exchange fits into this whole DeSci ecosystem, I provide a bit of the landscape. So when we think about science, and this is any type of academic science that maybe know from grad school or your college experience, you can segment it into 3 different boxes, where you have a funding ecosystem, an ecosystem where you can actually do the scientific experiment, and then you have a place or a set of organizations that you use to distribute your insight. And over the last couple months, really, we have seen a Cambrian explosion of organizations in the Web3 ecosystem that fill these different niches. So for example, we have Science Fund, Gitcoin, and VitaDAO, where open source developers and also scientists can raise funding to do their experiments. And in case of VitaDAO, they, in return for funding, give VitaDAO some IP ownership over the outcome. And then we have these distribution mechanisms such as Research Hub, Molecule, and the DeSci Foundation that are working on new tools to spread knowledge, oftentimes based on IPFS and direct content addressing. What is somewhat missing in the middle is a place where teams and tools are provided, and actually the invention can happen. And that's what we're building. And one of the key issues, however, when you try to do this whole thing online is, how do you provide scientific tools, right? They're really clunky and hard to use and complex. In fact, if we break it down and we just use biology as an example here, and we compare it with code, code is a very low cost of execution, like you can run it on your laptop most of the time, and it has high reproducibility. If I run it again and again, it will always give you the same result. Condition you have the seed set to be the same thing. In biology, it's the direct opposite. You have extremely high cost of execution and very low reproducibility. And ideally, we want to get to a point where you can have people remote control the process of biological experimentation. So basically, how do we get to a point where doing biomedical research is feeling a lot more like writing code than actually standing in the lab pipetting something as some kind of custom-made experiment? Now, this is a pretty big task to tackle. And one way you can break it down first is to say, well, let's focus on applications that are high cost of execution and high reproducibility before we go for the high cost of execution, low reproducibility type of workflows. And I'm going to go into that in a sec. And what we want to do is we want to create an exchange, Lab Exchange, that you can access with the OpenLab client, that is a DAO-governed peer-to-peer exchange for data-generating laboratory services and just generally scientific services. So that if you have someone in the DAO that knows the laboratory workflow or scientific compute application really well, and you have someone else in the DAO that wants to consume that service, they have a way to lower their cost of trust to engage in a fruitful coordination. Now, we're not going to be able to just attach a lab right away to this exchange, but we can start with stuff that's really hard to set up if you don't know how to do it. and still highly reproducible, and only computational in nature. And this is just an example of an application that we've built together, where the original scientists that developed this method, which is called Equibind, you can use it to basically, on your computer, model the way that a small molecule, which is basically most of the drugs that you know from the pharmacy, interacts with a protein, which is what most of your body is made of next to water. And you can model the interaction between these two. This is actually a pretty complicated set of software to get running, and especially takes a lot of resources to run at scale. It's very inaccessible for a lot of scientists. But with the exchange, you can get access to it within LabDAO. And the author was Hannes Stark, and a community member that's maintaining it is Calvin Wallace. So we're basically dividing also the labor of there's a scientist that invents it, but then there's also a group of open source maintainers that keeps it going. And this is just one vignette. We have other services as well for language modeling of antibodies, RNA sequencing, protein folding, but also actually some wet lab services that you would know from your rotations, such as protein expression. Now, we don't want to be, in the core team, the ones that only onboard these applications. We actually want to motivate everybody in the community to onboard applications. And I'm very happy that there are 4 projects, particular in this current Gitcoin round, that are raising funding to build their applications and to provide them to the community. And if you're interested in rainforest monitoring, synthetic biology, large language models for human mental health research, and knowledge graphs, then give this a look. You can find them at labdao_gr15 in the bit.ly at the bottom. Now, this is DappCon, and I know we're all passionate about dApps, but the most intuitive way for a scientist, especially a bioinformatician, to interact with these laboratory services is actually not through a dApp, but through a command line interface, where we're basically serving a CLI client that's based on TypeScript for people to interact with the exchange. And when you look at this here, the user can install the client and has a local Ethereum wallet where they can manage their account. They can list all the apps that are available. They can interact with the exchange, for example, by posting a request for an application run, or by actually doing the application on their own hardware. And they can manage their file input and output via IPFS and Filecoin for the pinning. And for this, we're closely working together with the Bacalab team and Protocol Labs, which is currently working on a compute over data infrastructure to compute very effectively over files stored using the Filecoin network. Now, how do you keep such an exchange secure when there is no cryptographic way to prove that the result that you got out is actually the intended result? Right? There is no prime number factorization that you can do to very quickly check whether the result is correct that you've paid for. So you need to create some more social technology to make sure that the stability of the exchange is intact. And one way that we go about that is with 3 different methods. The first one is an escrow and arbitration service. So if a community member pays another community member to do a laboratory service for them, the money isn't directly sent to them. And in case of a conflict, there's an arbitration service that can mediate. We also have a governance tokens that you would have to stake in order to participate in the market economy. And if you're a bad actor, your stake and your participation in the community can be reduced. And then last but not least, the community is also actively voting on what are the laboratory services that it admits into the exchange ecosystem to make sure that a lower bar of quality is maintained. And this is just an example for how some of the metadata can look like when you have a run where there's a name for the laboratory services, and then there's always a hextet of information about me as a user, the parameters I provide, the input data I give you, and then you as the recipient, the metadata that you have from your run, and then the output that you give me back. What we hope to arrive with all of this is that we can see a global standardization of laboratory services. And the simple game theory here is when you have a high cost of conflict resolution, when everybody is doing tailor-made services, over time, we will gradually arrive at a point where these laboratory services are going to be highly standardized and reproducible, and also composable. And a very good analogy from history is the shipping container, where before we had the shipping container in the form that we know it today, people were exchanging a lot of information and overhead information about the dimensions of the load that they wanted to exchange, until people just said, look, this is way too much conflict. Let's just create the standard size for us to transact. And I think we're very close to that in the, some of biomedicine today as well. So that eventually we can arrive at a point where instead of just having custom one-to-one relationships on the exchange, where scientists have these one-to-one interactions to get work done and collaborate, we can have many-to-many interactions. We can have actually some market liquidity where there's a spot price for getting DNA synthesized or DNA sequenced. And then over time, we might arrive at a future where actually the whole scientific project can be described as an executable knowledge graph where I can write JSON and I define this experiment, then the next experiment, and the next data processing step. And basically, my information can just travel through these different markets. At the end of the day, science has always been about open source. It's been about doing an experiment and then sharing your knowledge with the rest of the world in the most accessible form. However, a lot of science is actually built on tools where knowing the source code alone is just not enough. Like looking at a paper and knowing how they did the experiment is not enough. What's really great would be if they didn't only tell you how to run the experiment, but they would do it for you with your parameters. And that's what we want to get to. We want to move from open source to open tools, where it's not about downloading Stable Diffusion, running it on your own laptop. It's about just pinging the Stable Diffusion API so it can be run on someone else's machine. Because we believe that open tools accelerate progress. If everybody doesn't have that setup cost, you can actually improve the rate of technological innovation. And then also, you can offer interesting and regenerative economics for the open source scientists that are maintaining these tools. Because if I pay for someone to run a computer for me or to do a laboratory service for me, the person that has mastered how to do it because they maybe even invented it, they can keep earning from that revenue for a way longer period than usually. Also, such an exchange opens up a marketplace for physical laboratories that are currently competing for open direct requests on a CRO marketplace that the biopharma industry knows. And then last but not least, with LabDAO, we're trying to build a community of scientists and inventors that can accelerate each other and actually develop new ventures, new IP that can be then even aggregated in NFTs, which is something that we'll probably hear more about in just a couple minutes. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. If you want to learn more and stay in the loop on our upcoming client release, head to our Discord, LabDAO, and I see you there. And happy to take any questions if the time allows. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
All right.
All clear?
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.